Iowa City is a unique community. This uniqueness is shaped by the people who contribute their ideas, their energy, and their gifts to the life of Iowa City and the university. Welcome to a series of biographical interviews of special women and men who have affected this community. Their lifelong contributions have been valuable, their lives creative and full. What brought them here? Who influenced them? What contributions are they the most pleased about? These and other questions will be explored during this series of interviews entitled, Tell Me Your Story. 35 years ago, Dr. George Forell joined the faculty of the School of Religion at the University of Iowa. Director of the school for 5 years, he was named Carver Distinguished Professor of Religion in 1973. Dr. Forell's name reaches far beyond Iowa City, as he is one of the world's foremost authorities on the work of Martin Luther. He is the author of more than 100 articles, reviews, commentaries, as well as some 20 books on religion, ethics, and Luther. Dr. Forell has received 4 honorary doctorates and can pick and choose among constant offers as a visiting professor. Except for occasional semesters lecturing in Europe, Asia, Africa, and the United States, his career has been centered in Iowa City. Welcome to this series, Dr. Forell.
Thank you.
You are an ordained Lutheran minister.
Right.
Your father and your grandfather were also Lutheran ministers. Did you know growing up that you too would follow in their footsteps?
Well, there was certainly a tendency in this direction in our family. It is not uncommon in Europe that people will follow in the footsteps of their parents. It probably was also more common in this country years ago. But as any other teenager at a certain stage, I decided that this probably was not for me. But what really refocused my thinking was my experience with the Nazis. See, I was raised in Germany. I was 14 years old when Hitler came to power, and then my father immediately left Germany, and we followed him, and we went to Austria in 1934.
1934.
And then in 1934, I went through these various revolutions that occurred there, the murder of the Prime Minister Dollfuss and all this. We were for a while in a little mountain village in Austria.
Were you hiding?
Well, we were there, and the Nazis took over there, and then they were driven out again. That's 34. And then in 38, of course, they were at my home, looking for my dad, who fortunately had left already.
But they were looking for him because of his protesting?
Because of the work he had done with refugees. My father was after the Nazis came to Germany, there he had been a pastor, particularly engaged in work with the labor unions and the working people. And when he came to Austria, he was put in charge by the ecumenical church, the Protestants from all over the world, to do work with the refugees that came into Austria in large numbers, because there was no language change for a German who wanted to flee from the Nazis would quite normally go to Austria because there he could get a job without having to learn a new language. And so there were thousands, literally, coming in there, many of them Jews, of course, and the Jewish people took care of the Jews that were coming in, but nobody really was taking care of the Protestants that were coming in, and the Protestants were really a minority, a very small minority in Austria. And so my dad did that work for the church and was immediately on the list. When the Nazis came, they came to our home almost immediately, but he was not home.
And then you left?
And left immediately.
And
he was gone by the time the Gestapo came.
Then they fled into, as I remember reading, into France, and then what happened to you? How did you get to the United States?
Well, I had no intention of staying in Austria after I had done a couple of semesters at the University of Vienna, because I knew, like almost any politically alert person, that there was no future for Austria, that the Nazis would take Austria. Everybody knew that as soon as Mussolini would tolerate it, and that was the reason that the Nazis had not won in 34, as soon as Mussolini would permit it, the Nazis would take Austria, and they did. And I had anticipated that and had made an application to study in America. And while this got more complicated as a result of the Anschluss, I did finally get here 50 years ago in January 1939, and did the rest of my theological education
back
in
east,
Philadelphia.
in Philadelphia. And how did you tell us how you came to Iowa City?
Well, I was at the time a professor of philosophy, actually, at a small Lutheran college in Minnesota, Gustavus Adolphus College. And the University of Iowa was looking for at those days they had a Roman Catholic, a Jewish, and a Protestant theologian. And they were looking for this Protestant, and they picked on me, and I became the professor for Protestant thought here at the School of Religion. And that has changed then over the years. You know, that was in 1954. And but since 54, I've been teaching courses generally on Christianity and on Christian ethics, with a few, every once in a while, on Luther and on the Reformation.
Well, that leads me into my next question. You stated that in a pluralistic society, or excuse me, pluralistic world, religion is as important as anything else, whether it's modern India, modern Japan, or the United States. Is this one of the main reasons to teach religion in a state university?
Well, I think that the last few decades have certainly shown that one of the great shortcomings of educated people in America is their deplorable lack of knowledge about religion. Not only their own religion, but the religion of other people. And some of the foolish things we have done in the world, we have done because we simply didn't understand the basic thought patterns of other people. We thought we can't understand anything about Islam. And so we relate to the Ayatollah Khomeini in an absolutely foolish way. I mean, remember that story about somebody going there with a cake and a Bible?
And a Bible?
Yeah. Well, you know, you have to be a little ignorant, to put it very politely, to approach somebody of another background in this way. And I think that all students, whether they have any religion themselves or not, just as part of their education, ought to know something about the religions of the human race, including their own. I mean, to me, one of the deplorable things is that so many people come to the University of Iowa who have never read the Bible. They can't understand Milton, or they can't understand Chaucer, they can't understand Shakespeare, and they can't understand Updike. If you don't know anything about the Bible, you don't know anything about the way in which people express themselves in our tradition. That's the background. That's the symbol system that we use.
Were there people who challenged having religion taught in the state? You weren't teaching worship.
No, no. Of course, at first, when the School of Religion was founded, there was some discussion whether this could be done. In the meantime, there have been Supreme Court decisions that it is perfectly right to teach about religion in a state university. In fact, it'd be perfectly right to do it in grade school. What you can't do, according to the court, is to worship. And people get these two things always mixed up. And I think the School of Religion at the University of Iowa is not a part of a denominational attempt to teach people how to pray. Our attempt is to introduce people not only into the religion of the American people, namely essentially Christianity and Judaism, but also eventually we hope to. We have now people in Buddhism. We don't have a chair in Islamic studies, but we would like to have a broad opportunity for students at Iowa to learn about other people's faith.
Well, you have taught over 25,000 students in your career here at Iowa. What did you try to convey in the classroom that kept students coming back year after year, signing up for your classes? What's your style of teaching?
Well, I would think that what brought the students there was that I think religion is exciting. It is not boring. I think that most of them come with the assumption that it is boring. I will not tell you where they learned that, but that is the assumption with which they arrive. And we have made a very real effort to show how interesting and exciting the study of religion can be. And apparently successfully, at least we have always had lots of students.
Obviously very successfully. I read in a newspaper article that one of your fondest accolades came on a university evaluation form which asked students to name their favorite instructor, and one undergraduate couldn't remember your name but answered, "The old guy with a foreign accent."
Yeah, I thought it was very nice.
I'm sure you're very pleased for that comment. Undergraduate students and graduate students have meant a great deal to you. What have you learned from them?
Well, it's always nice to have people with open minds, curious people. And some of my undergraduate students have been people that were willing to learn. They didn't know very much, but they were willing to learn, and they were curious. And nothing is as challenging to a teacher but to deal with people who are honestly curious, who really want to know. And I've had lots of those students, some of them amazingly ignorant, simply because they had no background. But willing to learn and spend an awful lot of time becoming knowledgeable. And that has been a challenge to me. It's particularly freshmen. I've always been very, very fond of freshmen because they are the ones that are so willing to try anything and to really are excited about a library that has millions of books. You know, this is really an exciting group. And then, of course, I have had very fine graduate students, and that's a different experience. There you can, that's almost like having children.
I'm sure.
And
you watch them grow for, what, 4 or 5 years?
Yes,
what is the PhD program?
The shortest that anybody's ever done it is probably 3 years, and the longest probably hasn't. Again, sometimes it takes an awful
still
long
going
time.
to school.
But these people challenge you. They often, I would say generally, know more about the subject that they have studied than you do, and so you learn a lot from them. And they will perhaps redirect your own thinking and make you approach things differently, or even change your mind on something. And that, I think, is very important. It's very hard to have that experience if you only teach undergraduates, because you obviously know more. Otherwise, you ought to be fired if you don't know more than your undergraduate students. But good graduate students will raise all kinds of questions which are important and help you grow. And I think that that is one of the exciting things about having the opportunity to teach not only undergraduates but also graduates.
Graduate students. In your years with dealing with these students, what are their major concerns, especially these freshmen, sophomores coming in? What questions are on their minds? Well,
this has changed over the years. We have had, if you think about over a period of 35 years, we have had students come at periods of great international tension, at periods of relative calm and quiet, and that has affected them. At some time, students really came to the university very much interested in changing the world.
The 60s.
Yes, and obviously with a very rather short-sighted notion how this is going to be done. That means that they assumed that the world changes easily, and it doesn't. And that was their problem. But then we have had students, I think in recent years we have often had undergraduates who are really very vocationally oriented. They come to the university to try to get a certificate that will enable them to make more money. I had a young lady, very attractive young lady, when I asked her in one of these discussion groups that I used to have, why are you here? And she said, I want to become rich and famous. I mean,
she meant it.
She meant it. Yes.
Well, she was honest anyway.
I don't think she became either rich or famous because I haven't heard from her since. But But that was there are such people, and I think the nice thing is that they come right out and tell you, and that's typical for freshmen. They don't put on a show. They don't tell you what they think you want to hear, because she knew that I didn't want to hear that.
do any of them want to know, like, who am I? And
well, that comes up. One of the books that I made freshmen read, and some of my colleagues thought that that was really a big mistake, is a book by Paul Tillich called The Courage to Be, which raises all kinds of basic questions that are sort of underneath the surface in most freshmen and sophomores in college, but that Niebuhr and that Tillich has the gift of bring up into the open. He refers to them as the great human anxieties, and he talks about the anxiety of being, and the moral anxiety, and what he calls the existential anxiety, the fact that I don't know the meaning of life. And all these anxieties he openly discusses, and sometimes I fear I have raised them in such a way that for the first time these people, though they had them all the time, found language for them, found ways of expressing them. And I think that has been helpful, that they could address something that everybody has to address.
of course, were they excited about this assignment?
Oh yes. I mean, my job was a little bit to translate Tillich's somewhat overly philosophical language into the language
I've read it. It is.
of ordinary college freshmen. But once it was, they understood it, they appreciated that these questions had been raised, and they wanted to find answers to the questions from their own point of view.
We touched briefly on the 60s. I want to talk a little bit about this period. You've always, in the past, been a kind of a social activist and involved in party politics, once serving as a delegate to the Democratic National Convention. During the Vietnam War, you were a critic and supported the protesting students. Would you share a bit about your recollections of this period?
Well, it was an interesting period. I thought our engagement in Vietnam was a very serious error, and I hoped that something could be done to get us disentangled much earlier than we in fact did get disentangled. And so when the students took part in these protests against the Vietnam War, I encouraged them and I identified with them. I did not particularly encourage any kind of violence. This is against my basic theological orientation. But I became involved in one very controversial situation, quite innocently, as a matter of fact. There was a mass meeting on the steps of the old Capitol. There were about 2,000 students there protesting the Vietnam War. And some of them were a pretty rowdy lot. And I was at home in bed. And at 12 o'clock at night, one of the deans, I will not mention any names, called me and said, George, would you come and help us calm down the multitudes, because they had just broken into the old Capitol and they were getting sort of destructive. And since they trusted me, they knew that I was in agreement with their ultimate purpose, although in this particular instance not with their particular procedure. Well, I got dressed and showed up. And we discussed the war and the alternatives that we had in trying to make our sentiments heard. And I thought a very nice discussion, including singing of hymns and prayer, which I did not as part of my professorial duties. And the crowd sort of calmed down. At this point, by some misunderstanding, the order was given to clear the Pentacrest, and the National Guard was brought in and things like that. Now, most people left, but 200, a little over 200, stayed on the steps of the old Capitol, and of course I could have left. But I...
You were dressed.
I was now in a situation where my credibility was at stake. If I left them now, I'd calm them down. I thought there's no reason for arresting people for singing and praying. And so I stayed, and we were all arrested.
And you went to jail?
I went to jail. I remember one moment in jail, which is one of those pleasant moments that I remember with great joy, but remember my dying day. One of my students was arrested with me. She happened to be a Jewish girl. And she called her mother. Everybody had a phone call. She called her mother, and she told me, her mother said, "Lynn, I knew that would happen. Sooner or later you'd get arrested." And she said, "Mom, Forell is in jail too." And the mother said, "Then it's all right."
Oh.
So, so that was
a blessing. Forgiveness.
So the fact that I was in jail with the kids, 202 or so, helped to defuse the situation. We were all acquitted, by the way. Not one of them was. We were charged, and the judge dismissed charges. We had not committed any crime. So there was a happy end to that particular instance.
You have influenced a lot of your students. I want to know who or what influenced you in your life?
Well, you mentioned before that I come from a family to whom religion means a great deal. That you have known my mother,
yes,
and I had a grandmother just like her also. And so there are a great many important women that have influenced me, women of faith. And of course my grandfather, my father were people that were models for me, influenced me greatly. But then I had very wonderful teachers.
In Austria,
well,
in Germany?
No, in America.
In America.
The teacher that probably influenced me more than anybody else, and that is somewhat responsible for the strange combination of, for a Lutheran, of social activism and theological orthodoxy. I'm a fairly funny combination of being somewhat to the right theologically and quite to the left politically. This was Reinhold Niebuhr. Reinhold Niebuhr was my professor at Union Theological Seminary. I wrote my dissertation for him.
I didn't know that. How wonderful.
And he was just such a amazing person. He had a tremendous influence in American politics. I mean, but he had this ability to combine great social passion with profound theological analysis. And I have learned a great deal from him, and he has influenced me greatly. I would say that the people that I have read, like Karl Barth, influenced me very early in my life. I think he probably had more to do with my decision to go into theology than anybody else outside of my family. But once I had made this decision, the individual that influenced me most was Reinhold Niebuhr, although I had also Paul Tillich as a teacher at Union. But Tillich, I didn't get to, I had his classes, but I didn't get to know him very well until we both taught for a semester in Hamburg. And we were colleagues. At first I had been his student, but then in 1957, 58, he was a visiting professor at Hamburg, and I had a Fulbright at Hamburg. And so for the first time now, the roles were changed. We were now colleagues, and I got to know him quite well and learned to appreciate him a good deal.
I read in a speech that you said that the 20th century is a very religious age. Could you briefly explain this?
Well, I have said that because I've heard so many times that we live in the post-religious age. Now, people that say that either don't read the newspapers or they don't read it very well. We certainly live in an age in which religion is a major factor in almost every crisis we enter, whether this is in Sri Lanka or in Ireland or in Lebanon or wherever you go. And this, you see, this doesn't necessarily mean that this influence is entirely positive. I think sometimes it's extremely negative. But to ignore it is really to ignore a major factor in the way in which people organize their thinking and their life. And it seems to me very interesting that here in Iowa, a few miles from Iowa City, at the end of the 20th century, we have the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi
in Fairfield
University. So an aspect of Hindu thinking plays an important part in America. And my claim is that for the first time in this century, all kinds of religions that people thought were absolutely dead are alive and well. And I know people who don't even realize it's a religious practice, that the first thing they do in the newspaper is read the astrology column. But astrology is a religion, it's a pre-Christian religion.
Magic.
Right. And you have witchcraft, magic, you have all these things. We have things that people thought had been forgotten. Suddenly, all over the place, they spring up. Now, I, of course, have a fairly broad and inclusive view of religion. But it seems to me that religion is very important in the lives of people, and it is foolishness to act as if it didn't exist. It won't go away. My claim is, as you know, that in the 20th century, religion has taken the place that sex had in the 19th century. In the 19th century, everyone knew that sex was around, but they didn't talk about it.
Everybody knows religion is around, but they don't want to talk about it.
Nobody wants to talk about it. It's not polite to talk about it. And I think that's foolishness.
And now we're come full circle that, you know, one of my first questions was why teach religion in a state university? And now, I mean, that just underscores why we should. My last question, and I wish we had more time because I think I could talk to you for hours. You're retiring from teaching this year, but I'm sure you're not retiring from writing, preaching, and guest lecturing. What are your plans now?
Well, I have I'm going to teach in Chicago in the summer at St. Olaf College in Northfield also this summer. That next fall I'm going to give some lectures at the University of Iowa because they have asked me to do that. And next spring I will be again at the Lutheran Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. I have not planned much beyond that. I have an invitation to go to Southern California, but since I've said so many terrible things about Southern California in my career, I don't know whether it's safe for me to go to Southern California, but that's one of the things but I want to keep on working as long as I can.
I'm sure you will, and I'm so appreciative of you being my guest today.
Thank you.
My guest has been Dr. George Forell, noted scholar, teacher, theologian with a national and international reputation based on his work in the field of Christian ethics. He has taught over 25,000 students over the course of his extraordinary career in Iowa. At one time, about 10% of the student body was taking a religion course. Here is a man who has made a difference. Iowa City and the university are indeed richer for Dr. Forell making this community his home. I wish you well in your next endeavor. Thank you for being my guest on Tell Me Your Story.